welcome in our YouTube platform, Realizing Europe. Today we are in Edinburgh, Scotland, UK still. We talk with Oliver Escobar, origin Espanol, origin Galicia, and experienced all the battles between fascism, post-fascism, and democracy, and now working in Edinburgh, in the University of Edinburgh, and he is a senior lecturer on public politics, co-director of What Works for Scotland, and he's an expert, I can say, an expert in how to organize participative democracies. You have all this knowledge about democracy, about different sorts of democracies. What would your dream be of Europe within 5 years and everything would be perfect?
Yeah, I suppose that's the million euros question. Yeah, I don't think there is a magic bullet, but I think there are a number of reforms that could really help. And I think there is a broad coalition of people who understand that we need to make European institutions connect better to people on the ground. Perhaps coming back to some of the notion of the Europe of the regions of some years ago, rather than this Europe of the super states. So there's something around that, but there's also something about improving how the European Parliament works. And there are some interesting democratic innovations, such as citizen chambers, where you could use lottery to choose a citizen-led body that would help the elected body to develop and scrutinize legislation. And then, of course, there is the whole range of opportunities for crowdsourcing and online legislative work, policymaking work. So I think we are only beginning to scratch the surface of the things that could be done at a scale, things that a few years ago couldn't be done. Now I think we're beginning to get a sense of how certain experiments with online democracy as well as with deliberative democracy could help to open up new ways of engaging with the European institutions, but also to kind of re-energize European institutions and improve their democratic credentials.
There are several different points we have to improve on, and these are now possible. Mm-hmm. And that's the institutions of the institutions have to connect more with the citizens. The European Parliament should be better. There should be, you mentioned citizen chambers, you mentioned crowdsourcing, and you said European of the regions instead of European of the nations. So can you elaborate on, well, we can take them one by one.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Well, I suppose for me it all boils down to one question, and this is a question that we can apply to nation states and democratic polities in general, and also to developments like the European Union. And the question is, what kind of citizen are we inviting citizens to be? And too often our institutions are built on the premise that citizens are invited to be voters every few years, spectators of the political game, bystanders, people who react or complain, so complainers. And once you create institutions premised on that understanding of citizenship, naturally, the version of democracy that we get is a very elitist version. Now, if you change the question, if you change the answer, and the answer to the question, what kind of citizen are citizens invited to be, and you begin to think in terms of, how about we create institutions that treat citizens as collaborators, co-producers, problem solvers, thinkers, deliberators. Once you get into that mode and you begin to rethink systems design in terms of a fuller, deeper, and more meaningful form of citizenship, then I think we are on track to develop the kind of institutions we need in the next 50 years, because we are just now at a critical point in time. I don't need to, we all know what's coming down the line. We know we're in an environmental crisis. We know there are massive issues with population displacement, and it's likely to get worse. We know about the artificial intelligence revolution, the biotechnology revolution. Everything that in the next 20 years is going to change how we think and do, not just democracy, but everything around us. So I think we have two choices. We either are keep going like we are going, and therefore are just reacting in a reactive mode to all these issues, kind of pressing our institutions and institutions that are not designed to cope with those kind of complex issues, or we get into proactive mode right now and we build the foundations for democracy over the next 50 years. And I think that that's the task of our generation, and that's what we call the field of democratic innovation, which is what I work.
What kind of citizens do we invite our citizens to become? Or what do we expect them to become? What sort of structure do we approach them? And we classically approach them as voters, complainers, or people who are passive. And that means that we have an elite democracy. And then I think you mean that those people can decide and the other can complain. But what if, you said, if we choose our citizens to invite in another way of becoming a citizen, to becoming a collaborative citizen, problem-solving thinker and co-creation, then we have another level of citizens. And this is necessary because we face all these huge crises like the environmental, artificial intelligence, biotech, and the migration crises. So we need this in the coming 20 years. Or we go on in the same way, reactive, and then we push our institutions to solve this. Or we go in proactive, and that is innovate in the field of democracy. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the questions I get asked very often when I share these ideas is the question of, how is a more participatory form of democracy different from some of the destructive populism that we see emerging across the world. I'm thinking of certain, all sorts of very traditional authoritarian models of leadership that seem to be advancing in countries all over the world. As you know, that we are at a time of democratic recession. We have, in the last 10 years, we have lost a lot of democracies all over the world. The Economist Democracy Index considers that there are just now only 19 full democracies in the world. The United States used to be amongst the 20. Now there are only 19 because the states, due to some violations of rights and a number of challenges to do with the division of powers and so on, it has fallen off that ranking. So, basically only 4.5% of the world population living a full democracy. So that's where we are. And it's a trend. A few years ago, we used to talk about democratic deficits, democratic crisis. Now, some of us at least are ready to start talking about democratic recession, which is a dangerous place to be. But it's really important to make a distinction between a participatory form of democracy, where citizens get chances to engage in the policy and decision-making processes that affect their lives at different levels, from the local to the transnational. And that's very different from some of the forms of destructive populism that we see emerging. How is it different? Well, populism tends to be based on a dynamic of elites, leaders, and followers. So populism is about creating followership. It's only about, if only we just got better leaders that will guide us to the promised land. It still does nothing to improve our sense of citizenship. It's a dynamic between leaders and followers. Participatory democracy is about developing a more fully fleshed form of citizenship. Of course, leadership has a role, but the protagonist here is models of citizenship where citizens are autonomous beings capable of taking in evidence and the perspectives of others, and then engage in public conversations that lead to good policy and decision making. So it's a completely different model. One is followers and leaders. It's about creating followership. The other is about creating citizenship.
So you said a very important question is, what is the difference between a participative democracy and all these new streams of populism popping up? And then you gave in between a very important relevant fact is that we have only 4.5% of the world population lives in democracy.
In a full democracy.
In full democracy.
Then
and
if you consider flawed democracy, then you go up to 49 or 50.
So you mentioned the economics democracy index is like 19 full democracies we have now instead
That's right.
of
That was
20 because
that's
Trump
right. Yeah,
destroyed
that's the
something.
Economist. There's
Yeah.
something called the Economist Democracy Index. There was one in 2016, another in 2018, and all these trends are
Okay.
reflected there.
And so that's very important. And then you said in a you can say populist destructive way of reorganizing democracy is always about leaders, authoritative leaders who have followers. In the participative democracy, we're not about leaders. They are leaders, but they're not the center court, because we talk about the fully participating citizenship, so that a citizen can be an autonomous human being taking decisions about his life and engaging in politics.
That's
Is
right.
that
Yeah.
correct? Yeah.
Not all populisms are the same. There are very different types of populism. There are progressive populisms and there are authoritarian populisms. And so it's a very complex, we shouldn't create this kind of a straw man of populism. But the destructive populism that we see in some parts of the world, that is about, leaders and followers rather than citizens. This is a really important thing to develop a bit more because some of the people watching this will have heard the term deliberative democracy, which in my mind, it's deliberative and participatory democracy at the moment go well together. We're not going to get into the conceptual distinctions. They are different in some ways, but they have a lot of synergies and they can be brought together in interesting ways. The important thing about deliberative democracy, which is based on the notion that, how about we create a democracy where decisions are based on the basis of the best available reasons and arguments and evidence and perspectives, rather than the power of numbers, money, lobbying, and so on and so forth. That's the premise of deliberative democracy. I believe that we can engage in conversations that help us find the best way forward, re-examine our own perspective in light of the perspective of others, and take into account long-term considerations, trade-offs, and so on, and then come to a conclusion that is reasoned and ideally as inclusive as possible in terms of the process that led there. So that's the sort of definition. But the important thing, what deliberative democracy is bringing to the table is a really important switch or shift in the way we think about citizenship and humanity, to be honest. So in the 80s and the 90s, those of us who were, I was a little bit younger, so I wasn't already steeped into these issues. But when I got to study political science in Santiago in 1997, we were still at a time where rational choice theory and a whole theory of how humans are, based on an economicist model, was very much the kind of
Homo economicus, yeah.
Yeah, the assumption there was, humans are prepackaged bundles of fixed preferences. So we just need to aggregate them through an election, through the market, right? So we already know what we want. Our preferences are fixed. We just need to find our expression through these instruments of politics or the economy. Now, deliberative democrats offer a counterpoint, and the whole deliberative democracy paradigm is based on contesting that notion of the homo economicus, and in saying, well, actually, we're not bundles of fixed prepackaged preferences. We only discover what we want, where we want to be, how we want to live, the world we want to contribute to. We only discover all of that as we engage in conversations with others. So we are developmental beings that need to keep engaged with the world in an ongoing conversation with the world at hand and people in it, in order to find the best ways of making collective decisions and taking forward the collective project of a locality, a country, the globe, the world. So that shift is really important. It's the way we think about humans, not just as instruments for the market or aggregation through elections, but as developmental beings that need public life and collective organizing in order to find the ways forward that we need to tackle all these challenges, as well as to fulfill some of the promises that progressive thinking has been offering for 100 years.
Yeah. So the next phase is that you say there is a difference between this classical democracy, where we have also connected to this populism, but where we have this roots of democracy founded in the idea that the human beings are a pre-packed, fixed set of fixed preferences, and you just in the market have to find out how do we satisfy that, or in politics, how do we adjust our measures to that. And then you said no, in the deliberative democracy, that's a complete different paradigm, because there we go into dialogue, into conversation, to find, based on arguments, based on knowledge, based on dialogue, and based on long-term thinking and short-term thinking, what is the best for all of us, and how can we invent ourselves, define ourselves, and even I said we can aspire our dreams, our hopes together. But that's a sort of mental being focused action. So that's the difference of the deliberative democracy.
One of my favorite expressions in English is the expression talking shop. I don't know if you heard it, but basically when you talk about talking shop is a place or a space or a process where we talk, but nothing happens. So it's a very useful concept, for a lot of these traditional government consultations and so on. But there's a broader argument to be made about that, because on the one hand, I would argue that talk without action is toothless, but action without talk can be mindless. And so we need both. We need to talk, and then we need to act.
What if you consider this? How do you see then this European dream? And you talked about this Europe of the regions. I think it's something related to this deliberative democracy. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, that takes us back to where we started, which is institution building and redesigning our institutions. I don't think it's enough. A lot of people working on participatory democracy focus on social movements and what happens on the streets, and all of that is really important. That's where I come from as well. That's where I started doing research, but it's not enough, because we cannot stop just in the streets. What we need is to remake the institutions so that they are capable of taking up all these new capacities and aspirations and so on in more meaningful ways. So for me, it comes down to redesigning some of the institutions we have and creating new institutions as well. And we talked earlier about parliament. Our parliaments need help. They're stretched to the limit. That's not just the European Parliament. That's every national parliament that I know. But we also need to rethink, mechanisms to involve citizens that don't depend just on elections and voting. And this takes us back to citizens' assemblies, things like participatory budgeting, online crowdsourcing, all this kind of. And I'm not saying that there are easy answers or silver bullets. What I'm saying is this is the moment when we get a chance to experiment and set the foundations so that we don't need to be doing all of this in 20 years' time, reacting to everything that is coming down the line. Now is the time for reimagining our institutions, tweaking the old ones, creating the new ones, experimenting, so that then in a few years' time we have a democracy that is fit for purpose. Well, there are two developments. We are in Scotland, so I'll mention two things that are happening in Scotland that are promising. So Scotland, for example, has now a policy of participatory budgeting across the country. Local government and national government have agreed that a percentage of all local budgets will be directly allocated by citizens. We are only at the beginning. The system is being put in place. There are all sorts of difficulties, but we're working on it. And the next few years, we will get to learn a lot about the outcomes. And the other interesting development is that Scotland is also experimenting a lot with deliberative mini-publics, things like citizens' duties, citizens' assemblies. So the Scottish Parliament, for example, is piloting the use of citizens' duties as part of the way Scottish Parliament committees work. And the Scottish government has recently started the process of a citizens' assembly on the future of Scotland. So we're going to learn a lot. So I invite all your watchers to keep an eye on what's going to be happening here, because either way, whether it is a total success or something that doesn't quite work, we're going to learn a lot. These things can all be scaled up. That's the key message.
They
really can. And not only can, they should. I mean, if we really want to rekindle the European project, we really need to look at this seriously.
I think it's very strong that you focus on also enforcing citizenship. Because for us as Socratic design, and I totally agree what you said about the classical theory starts from human being as a fixed set of preferences. This is the mystery of the homo economicus, or the Cartesian model, all these dirty assumptions. And we see that in education, we see that everywhere. The people are a victim of the model that has put of them. And you see how easy people can incorporate what's been put on them. So you formulated very well. I think you said we have to think how we invite citizens to become. And that's so very key. That's the key of transforming. And if you do this in practice, like you skip the whole abstract and academic pillars and silos, and you just, I saw also your PhD and you already was also focused on that. So that's really the key. And I was looking for the name who is, of course, the center of this, and I found that name. That is John Dewey, because John Dewey basically said the whole society is wrongly based. It's all fallacies. And basically we have to start. He didn't succeed in Chicago, but maybe he will succeed in Scotland and in Edinburgh.
I hope so, and you're absolutely right, John Dewey. But also, I mean, there's a clear connection to Socratic dialogue in that notion of developmental, conversational, shared kind of purpose.
We did it in intelligence is not in our head, like Descartes said. Intelligence is in between us.
Yeah, and making those connections.
And makes those connections. So
brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for coming.